Welcome back to Talking Dragon Age, the show where I talk about Dragon Age. This episode is about Andraste. Now, there's a lot going on with her, so I'm going to start with explaining her basic timeline and then get into some theories about her. So, back in the day, southern Thedas was occupied by the Ylamari tribes that preceded Ferelden and the Syrian tribes that preceded Orlais. Andraste was born in -203 Ancient. Her father was an Ylamari man who married a Syrian woman, but also had another daughter named Halasir with an alchemical advisor. I'm not sure which daughter came first, but Halasir's mother would disappear for unknown reasons. It's believed she was either exiled or killed by Andraste's mother. Well, Halasir and Andraste got along well as children, although it was a dark and stormy night. Halasir rolled out of a bed and wandered out of the house to follow strange lights into the woods. The young Andraste followed her sister, and that's where the story ends. Something happened. Halasir suffered some kind of violent death, and fires started. We'll get into theories later. Andraste was found pale and terrified. Her sister's death scarred her in many ways. She would often enter a trance-like state, after which she would report hearing voices as if from a lost memory. She would also then talk of strange auras and the sound of bells. The storm had made her very sick, and she suffered problems with her lungs for quite a while after that. It's believed this is why she was unable to have children until much later. Well, Andraste grew up and married Mavarath, which unified Ylamari tribes across a huge area. However, Tevinter foolishly raided an Ylamari town, which saw her father killed and Andraste kidnapped and enslaved. Leadership passed to Mavarath, but most Ylamari were still loyal to Andraste's father and would only follow Mavarath after he negotiated Andraste's release. Which is, I guess, what happened. I wasn't able to find any more information on how Andraste was released from slavery. Well, she returned to her homeland and wept for her people. She would go out into the woods to cry and pray, until, eventually, the Maker answered. Andraste rallied the Ylamari and spread word of the Maker, winning many converts among the Ylamari and beyond. This became the largest force outside of Tevinter, which was still recovering from the first Blight. Andraste started conquering more and more of Tevinter's territory and ended up allying with elven rebels led by Shartan. Plenty of theories about him. The Chant of Light doesn't like to talk about this, but Andraste's army suffered a number of defeats during this conflict. Regardless, she freed most of southern Thedas. Now, Mavarath's betrayal. It's open for debate why he betrayed her. His spirit in the Temple of Sacred Ashes said it was jealousy, maybe of her getting all the glory and or her love for the Maker over him. Some say Andraste risked everything they had won by pushing forward into Tevinter's more heavily fortified territory, and so Mavarath betrayed her to save everyone else. Whatever the reason, he sold her out to Tevinter, who burned her at the stake in front of many of her followers, including Shartan, who died attempting to save her. Allegedly. It was here that Archon Hassarian apparently came to believe she really was a prophet of the Maker and converted. He ended her suffering by driving a sword through her heart. Some claim Hassarian only converted out of fear that Andraste's armies would retaliate in full force. I don't think so, since even Mavarath was apparently worried that the armies wouldn't win, especially so now without him or Shartan to lead them. Well, regardless, it was 10 years later that Hassarian revealed Mavarath's treachery. Though the Canticle of Mavarath is dissonant and not included in the official Chant of Light, it apparently describes him repenting, further spreading the word of the Maker and Andraste, and that he was forgiven. Now, after Andraste's death, one of her disciples named Havard carried her ashes back to her homeland to find a worthy resting place for her, which he found in the Frostback Mountains. Havard had been gravely injured, but the touch of Andraste's ashes healed him and he pushed on. There is still debate over whether or not Andraste's ashes actually healed him or if it's just a metaphor. More theories on that later. So one thing I skipped about Andraste's life are her children. Like I said earlier, she couldn't carry children until later in life. Mavarath had 3 sons with his concubine, all of whom were adopted by Andraste as her own after their mother's death. However, sometime later in life, she became able to bear children. She had 2 daughters, Ebris and Vivial. Here's the thing about them. They were kept out of the public eye and were not permitted to marry, although they both had consorts. Ebris had only 1 child before she died. Her daughter, Ali Vimar, died less than a month later on a voyage to Denerim. Vivial, on the other hand, had fallen in love with a mage from Tevinter. The pair went into self-imposed exile as Andraste began her conquest, and later completely went into hiding after Andraste's death. Got some theories about that, too. Well, Vivial had 2 daughters of her own. Then those daughters only had daughters. Because of that, they each took their husband's name when they were married. Combined with the fact that Vivial and her husband went into hiding after Andraste's death, and the destruction caused in the second Blight, this is primarily why we can't trace Andraste's bloodline to a modern heir. Of course, there is the theory that it relates to Flemeth and Mythal. I have a theory of my own though, and she's going to get her own video. For now, let's talk about some of the theories about Andraste and her life. Chronologically, the first thing we should talk about is what happened to Andraste's sister, Halasir. We don't have a lot of information on the subject, so this is largely up for debate. Something I left out earlier is that later in life, Andraste would recall her sister's death as a matter of heresy, saying the alchemical advisor had been whispering of the old gods. Two things to keep in mind here are that Andraste may not have actually said that, and this is little more than propaganda. And also that, as much as it sucks to say, she could be lying. I don't think so, though. Most of these theories we'll discuss suggest she was either telling the truth or it was propaganda. And with that, the first theory about this is that Andraste murdered her sister. That was my first thought, but the more I think about it, I don't know. It's certainly a possibility, but doesn't seem like Andraste. And I don't mean the idealized version of the Chantry. I mean just looking at the available evidence, I don't think she fits the profile of someone who would murder her own sister. If she was, the effects she suffered after the fact wouldn't have been as severe, and it should have affected her whole life path more significantly. She likely wouldn't have become that benevolent symbol if something like that had scarred her from childhood. Now this is the one theory that would suggest Andraste was lying about the heresy, probably as a way to justify her crimes. But I personally don't think this theory adds up. I think our second theory is more likely, and that is that Andraste killed her sister in self-defense. She had been following strange lights out into the woods. Her sister was up to something. She may have attacked Andraste for reasons of her own, perhaps relating to her mother, or she may have been possessed. Being forced to kill her sister like that definitely could have caused the symptoms Andraste suffered. Now if Halasir was possessed, it still could have had something to do with her mother. And our third theory is that someone else was there. Perhaps Halasir's mother, perhaps some random bad guy. Maybe even a carrier of Mythal, which we'll talk more about later. The possibilities for who this person was or may have wanted are virtually endless. They may have killed Halasir. They may have made Halasir attack Andraste. Really, it's too much to speculate, but I would find it most likely that it had to do with Halasir's mother. Maybe that part of what Andraste said about it was true, but the old gods part was propaganda. Our fourth and final theory is that it really was just an accident. Maybe her sister was struck by lightning, or they were attacked by wildlife. The Syrian believed an animist spirit or blighted creature attacked them. The Alamari believed it to have been members of a rival tribe that killed her. Any of these definitely could have had that scarring effect on Andraste. But let's talk about the symptoms she suffered. Whatever happened, it was clearly traumatic. It seems like she repressed the memory, which is why she didn't talk about it for so long. That assumes she's telling the truth, but I believe she is. She would often enter a trance-like state. Afterwards, she would recall hearing voices as if from a lost memory, strange auras, and the sound of bells. You know, it's entirely possible that Andraste was possessed by something in the woods. Maybe by a spirit or demon, or maybe even by Mythal or another ancient entity. When I first read all this, I first thought that she was experiencing memories from that entity's past. Writing this now, however, I think it's more likely she was lost in a trance of what actually happened that night. The part that stands out are the sound of bells. If anyone knows of any other mention of that, please let me know in the comments. Moving on, let's talk about her vision of the Maker. There are many theories about what actually happened to her in the woods. Let's start by saying it is 100% possible that she did meet the Maker there. Bioware has said they will never conclusively confirm or deny the existence of the Maker. I completely respect that, though it won't stop me from making theories. The next theory is that she met Mythal and became her host. That relates to the fact that Andraste would go on to become a very powerful woman. However, the biggest thing that suggests a relationship with Mythal is that she only had daughters, and those daughters only had daughters. Who else do we know with such a reputation? So the theory here is that Andraste was a host of Mythal before Flemeth came along. Looking at their stories, they are similar in a few ways. For one, both are descendants of the Alamari, which are suggested to have had a relationship to the Elves. Also, they were both crying out for justice when a force came to them and gave them strength. However, there are a few things that don't quite add up in this theory. The biggest one being the Maker. The idea of the Maker wasn't really a thing before Andraste. Different human tribes had their own gods, and Tevinter obviously had the old gods. Although ancient Tevinter did have a name for the creator of the world. They didn't call him the Maker though, and they didn't really worship him. At least not in the way they did the old gods. So if Andraste had Mythal's spirit, why would she go around preaching the word of the Maker? You could say people needed a symbol to rally behind, but it didn't have to be the Maker. It could have been the Lady of the Skies, who is also theorized to have related to Mythal. It could have been anything. Why the Maker? Why invent this virtually new idea for people to rally behind? I guess we could chalk that up to Mythal wanting to shove history along her desired path. This theory also ties into the idea that Shartan was Solas, but I'm not going into that here. Moving on to the next theory, we're actually going to jump back a bit to Andraste's birth. It's accepted that Andraste was born in -203 Ancient, the same year Archdemon Dumat was slain. There is a theory that an old carrier of Mythal performed the Dark Ritual way back then. She's the one who told the Grey Wardens how to permanently stop the Archdemon. I don't think so. But let's go through it. Andraste's mother was a Syrian woman named Brona. The version of her in the Temple of Mythal says this.
A dream came upon me as my daughter slumbered beneath my heart. It told of her life, and of her betrayal and death. I am sorrow and regret. I am a mother weeping bitter tears for a daughter she could not save.
This theory would mean that Brona was a carrier of Mythal. That dream thing could well be related to Mythal. We already know of Mythal's interest in old god souls, but we also know that they aren't integral to her plan. We know that because the Warden in Origins can refuse to do the ritual, and some heroes of past Blights died when they slayed the Archdemon. That's why the Wardens knew how to do it. If the ritual was performed for Dumat as well, wouldn't that have been considered the only way to do it? The only Blight I couldn't find a known sacrifice for was the third. And the first, but that was because a ton of Wardens were involved in the slaying of Dumat. But that's a whole other can of worms. If you guys have your own thoughts on that subject, be sure to let me know in the comments. Maybe I'll talk about it more in Mythal's episode, whenever she gets one. Today we're here to talk about Andraste. Basically, while I do find the year of her birth suspicious, I'm not fully convinced she was born with Dumat's soul. Now let's talk about her ashes. Some have speculated that they only have healing properties because they were over a ton of Lyrium for so long. I have a few issues with this theory. Number one is that Havard had supposedly been healed with them before they were even moved to that resting place, but it is debatable whether or not that actually happened. The bigger issue I have with this is, why would Lyrium give the ashes healing abilities? Where else have we seen that? If Lyrium just sitting there can enchant what is basically dust, why isn't there more stuff with such healing properties? You could say it's the will of the Titan underneath, I guess, but again, there's not much to suggest they can even do that, let alone why they would care. You could make a case for it relating to why Liliana was revived, I guess, but she wasn't healed per se. No, I have an alternate theory. Andraste was possessed by a spirit of faith. Before the Maker came to her, Andraste grew up worshipping the Alamari gods, at least most of which were spirits. I think it's possible she met a spirit of faith as she prayed in the woods. That would explain a lot of her deeds if she was possessed by a benevolent spirit. And her ashes, well, perhaps the spirit is still a part of them, thus explaining their healing abilities. And we know by the gauntlet that Andraste's followers weren't opposed to working with spirits. Now I do want to talk a bit more about the temple. And this ties back into the Elves, because of course. The Temple of Sacred Ashes. During the fight there with Corypheus, we see a mosaic of Mythal. Now that further lends support to the idea that Andraste was a host from Mythal. In that case, Mythal would have told Havard to bring the ashes there. I am hoping that isn't the case. I think Andraste should be her own thing, and I'm frankly a little tired of the Elves worming their way into other stuff. You know, before Inquisition, I was yearning for more Elven stuff. Now that we know how much they were really involved with, I think it kind of detracts from the other stories if all roads lead back to Elves. Anyway, even if Andraste wasn't a carrier of Mythal, it stands to reason that the temple was already there. My theory is that the elves built the place, Havard rediscovered it, and chose it for the ashes. Now, we actually learn more about this place in War Table Operations in Inquisition. We start by searching previously unexplored passages, where we learn that there are way more than expected. One chamber of note contains runes that are neither Tevinter nor Elven. I like that they go out of their way to say they aren't Elven. It turns out they're Alamari in origin. Once translated, it's discovered they were actually written in code. It points to a large island in the waking sea. We send people to investigate and they find a very well-hidden vault. It explains that the Guardian retreated there, expecting to wait for more of Andraste's followers, but of course they never arrived. Since the ashes disappeared after the Warden was there, I expect the Guardian took them. Where he went after the vault remains a mystery. I sincerely hope we haven't seen the last of him. Now this video is getting long as hell, so I better wrap this up. Let's attempt to recap. Something weird happened to Andraste's sister. Something weird happened to Andraste in the woods. Something weird is going on with her ashes. Something weird is going on with the Temple of Sacred Ashes. Varric, help me out here.
This shit is weird.
Thanks. So that's it for now, guys. Thank you all so much for watching, and remember, Tala Nadas.